Welcome everybody to the War Museum's Freedom Day presentation. So the museum is honored to welcome Dr. Chris Holdridge as our speaker for this event. Dr. Holdridge has an impressive career in academics, starting his studies at the University of Cape Town, where he obtained his BA degree. He also completed his honors and masters at UCT, and in 2015 he was awarded his PhD from the University of Sydney. He is currently a senior lecturer and subject group head in history at the School of Social Sciences at Northwest University in Potchefstroom. Thank you, Dr. Holdridge. We look forward to your presentation.
Thanks for inviting me to present. So good day, everyone. So I only have about 15 minutes. The topic is on the Bloemfontein Conference of June 1899. I'll argue that wars obviously are never inevitable, and there's usually always diplomacy in the lead up to war. So the Bloemfontein Conference of June 1899 might at first appear a distant event from where we are today in 2022, with little relevance for the present. So in this brief talk, I will discuss the context of the Bloemfontein Conference and then try and foreground 3 points. Firstly, how historians have debated the causes of the South African War and the place of the Bloemfontein Conference of June 1899 within these debates. Secondly, I will explain how the origins and legacies of modern warfare in the international system are deeply rooted in a foundation of imperialism, and what this might mean for power and the politics of difference and our historical assessment of the past century. And finally, I provide some limited comments on and comparisons between the South African War of 1899 to 1902 and the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I must again emphasize very limited ones, particularly given the time and that I do not have expertise necessarily in Eastern Europe. So what was the Bloemfontein Conference and why should it matter? Why should it matter in the context of Freedom Day, which we celebrate tomorrow? Well, the conference involved a meeting of the British High Commissioner for South Africa at the time, Lord Milner, and the president of the ZAR, Transvaal, Paul Kruger, and their delegations and in Bloemfontein. Now, at issue was the question of uitlanders, those are non-Boer immigrants to the Witwatersrand goldfields, mostly British, who by then were majority in the Witwatersrand gold region, yet without burger rights to vote. Now, Milner hoped to achieve British dominance over the Transvaal via democratic subterfuge. Where Rhodes had failed with the botched Jameson raid a few years earlier, Milner hoped uitlanders would vote for Kruger's removal and thus install a new pro-British regime. But Kruger would not bite at the conference and instead offered, as a compromise, 7 years for British naturalization to burgher or citizenship status instead of the then 14-year period. Milner, as British High Commissioner, refused. Milner's additional demands that English as a language be used in the Volksraad, the Transvaal Parliament, and that all laws passed by the Volksraad require approval by the British Parliament in London were refused by Kruger. So soon the tone of anti-Boer sentiment began to ramp up towards war, made clear also in Milner's infamous Hellet's Dispatch, where he described the Transvaal as a small power that, quote, menaces the peace and prosperity of the war. So 3 months later, we have the outbreak of the South African War in 11th October 1899. Well, it's easy to frame the South African War within an older context of its older name, the Anglo-Boer War, or as a white man's war that ignores the contexts of settler colonialism that came before and that would follow in the 20th century. This is the denial of equality for Black South Africans, denial of recognized sovereignty of Black polities, and coercive laws over land and labor that shape segregation and apartheid. Now, this has been recognized by historians in debates over the past 40 years or so, the move away from this white man's war narrative, and hence the change of the name to South African War. Returning to the Bloemfontein Conference, even if Milner's demands were agreed to, women and the black majority would still have remained disenfranchised and unable to vote. And if we're thinking in the context of Freedom Day, it's white women who received the vote in 1930, so somewhat gender parity on racial and racist lines still, but it's only 1994 we're talking in the context of the vote that all adult South Africans could vote. Now, ideas of freedom and even the right to vote, and I think here of Milner's uitlander vote demands, can be used as an argument to deliver the opposite of freedom: war, invasion, the impression of a minority or majority. So I think it's important, if we're just having general reflections as members of the public, but even academically, that we first sort of really interrogate and think what the meanings of freedom are, that they are a lot more than a simple ballot cast at an election. So how have historians debated the impact of the Bloemfontein Conference? This is the first of 3 points. And I must admit here that this is very brief, and it is looking over much greater complexities. Now, Afrikaner nationalist historians until the 1970s roughly forwarded a narrative first voice in Jan Smuts's pen pamphlet, A Century of Wrong, which is published in 1899, and widely distributed and translated globally. Now, the central argument in A Century of Wrong was that British imperial aggression did not begin in the 1890s. The South African War could be traced back to the British occupation of the Cape Colony a century prior. But more importantly, the argument went that Boer national identity, a sense of sort of united patriotism in the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, and this is the Afrikaner nationalist argument, that this was well formed and resulted in this fight for freedom. So historians like Frans Johan Pretorius, John Boyer, and others have argued that this is quite misleading, largely because there was not a fully formed sense of Boer national identity at the time. It's much more of a motivation for defense of home and hearth, regional solidarity around commando lines. These loomed far larger within senses of self and motivation for war than any sense of united national identity at the time. But it still informed Afrikaner nationalist narratives that could read back a strong sense of Afrikaner nationalism into the war. One can question also what is meant by die Tweede Vryheidsoorlog, Second Freedom War, another word for the war. Was the idea of freedom encapsulated in this name for the war exclusivist for white Boers, to the exclusion of black inhabitants of the Boer republics, and even those black combatants who fought as armed aggressors? So claims to freedom can often mask over continued oppression. Similarly, another historical debate or framing here, again, I am simplifying, can have its roots at least very early on in Leo Amory's Times History of the War in South Africa, which is published a few months after the Bloemfontein Convention, and published in 1900. So Amory argued that Kruger was obstructionist and aggressive, with the Transvaal a security threat to the region, to the Southern African region. And it focused particular, among many examples of this, Kruger's obsessive desire for an expanded borders of the Transvaal reaching towards a dreamed for Indian Ocean port within Transvaal territory. Now this particular English explanation rarely questioned Britain's own imperial ambition, war-making, and coercive brinkmanship that marked its global dominance at this time. Now, this has obviously taken many, many different forms, and much more critical ones within that tradition in the decades following Amory's publication of the Times History. A Marxist interpretation also has its roots within J.A. Hobson's The War in South Africa, Its Causes and Effects, first published in 1900. So like Amory, Hobson was in South Africa during the war as a newspaper correspondent, Amory for the more conservative Times, London Times, Hobson for the left-leaning Manchester Guardian. Now, Hobson relied in his book, The War in South Africa, largely on a conspiracy theory that the landlords, those who dominated the control of capital of the Waterfront mining region, goaded or encouraged the British imperial state towards war to serve their own financial interests. And this is entangled in this conspiracy theory of Hobson within sort of a lot of a global network of, that the landlords were embedded within. Now, there's a large dose of anti-Semitism in Hobson's argument and stereotypes of avaricious, greedy Jewish landlords, which does not hold up to historical scrutiny. Now, the landlords were never united in their opinion, and many opposed the war and suffered financial losses because of hostilities that took years to recover from. So it fails as a work of history. Hobson was still compelling in his theoretical points. Although arguably a social liberal and not a Marxist, Hobson's writings on the South African War influenced, among others, the works of Vladimir Lenin. But the failure of the Bloemfontein Conference of June 1899 and the outbreak of the South African War, be read as caused by economic motives, is still a strong argument, if one avoids economic determinism, that is, explaining economics as being the sole sort of cause of the war. But this argument is strongest when contextualizing the longer settler colonial interests of the control of Black labor and the dispossession of land through legal regimes. This is war-making and law-making as bedfellows within imperial expansionism. One can make a good argument that Britain's war in South Africa was at least intended to increase its political and also economic control of the region for a longer-term gains. Historians have since distanced themselves from many of these earlier interpretations, but what I want to raise here is an important recent direction in historical scholarship that can frame ideas of freedom, rights, and law, and the place of the South African War within this, in the context of emerging international systems, particularly the emerging international system that was entangled within empire and the ideologies of racial difference. This is the second of my 3 points here. Now, the works of historians like Mircea Abenhuis and Marty Koskaniemi have done a lot here more broadly within the histories of international law, although they have not been read widely or influenced many South African historians of the South African War yet. Hopefully that will change. 10 weeks before the outbreak of the South African War in October 1899, several powers, mostly great powers, met at The Hague in the Netherlands to debate and draft the Hague Convention, the first of many governing the rules of law. So I use the term powers here instead of nation states because this was a world over 100 years ago of empire, when almost all those who met at The Hague governed empires globally. So the colonial world was spoken of at The Hague in 1899 as outside the realm of civilized warfare and at the margins of considerations for international law. So hence the language of civilized warfare between powers or nations compared to small wars in colonies. So the Boer republics fell uneasily at the margins here. Were there small powers, somewhat maybe considered within the realm of emergent international law, or rather subject to British suzerainty, that's dominance, without a seat at the international table. Our Black colonial subjects were provided even less regard within international law. This is in part explains the cloud of silence and deliberate obfuscation around Black combatants, the Black concentration camps, and Black civilians in the South African War. One can argue that too much publicity about the Black experiences of the South African War might compromise the narrative of a white man's war that could favor demands that the South African War be considered within the new frameworks of international law and the Hague Convention's moral and legal obligations, that these be applied to South Africa. Ideas of freedom from the violence and abuses of war were decidedly racial and racist at the time. As the world moved towards greater institutionalization of international politics and law in the 20th century, there were further Hague and Geneva conventions to protect civilians and combatants against wartime violence. There's also the creation of the League of Nations in 1919, the United Nations in 1945. All within this, the shadow of empire and the uneven discourse and legal protection afforded to global conflicts and wars has continued. Public opinion, law, and diplomacy often go hand in hand and are rooted in foundations of prejudice and power that stem back to our imperial past. So I think here of civil wars in Yemen, Syria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, all former colonies or trusteeship territories, whose wars garnered varied but limited reaction from the international community. You can see this as ongoing, and it's useful to think of its historical context here. Now, I'm going to conclude here by reflections to the Ukraine war and some very limited and loose comparisons. Some comparisons are fairly noticeable in their similarity. Russia's casus belli, or justification for war, based on the argument of minority rights for Russian speakers in the eastern regions of Ukraine. Arguably, one could make comparisons here to Milner's push for uitlander rights in the Transvaal a century earlier. There's the argument that the Soviet Union was in fact an empire as well, and that Ukraine, as a constituent part of this empire that ended around 1990, continued in the minds of and continues in the minds of Putin and others as not fully independent or not quite separated from Russian history. This has been a major justification for the restoration of Russia's imperial reach. Now, the argument seems out of track with history and the international norms of the 21st century, but the geopolitical case for this is being made in the Russian media. The Transvaal had been under British control briefly from 1877 to 1881, leading to an imperial argument that Britain had a rightful claim to restore control through invasion. The economic arguments also come to the fore. Ukraine's importance as a pathway for the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, its vast steelworks, supply for much of the world's wheat. There's a danger in comparing the Bloemfontein Convention of June 1899 to the failed diplomacy of the international community in Ukraine, including French President Emmanuel Macron, who's recently gained re-election. Unlike Ukraine, the Southern African region is fairly different with its settler colonial context. The Transvaal, Orange Free State, as well as the British colonies in the Cape and Natal, relied on a black majority for labor and on white minority rule for continued domination. It's quite different from the Ukrainian context. One can even argue that both Boer and Brit had already invaded African lands in the 1700s and 1800s, well before the South African War of 1899 to 1902. And so in terms of invasion, I think that's important to contextualize that in the South African War, what came before and after. We can look to the Ukraine and the horrors of war as a caution to defend ideas of freedom that includes everyone, no matter what gender, race, sexual orientation, age, or religion. We can look too at the horrors of the concentration camps against civilians, scorched earth tactics, and battlefield violence in the South African War as part of a longer 20th century of violence that's threatened freedom for all. These are all sort of framings, which I think we sometimes lose focus of when we look at the South African War. We should also question the stories we tell each other about war. Wars in isolation with set time periods, narratives that can further arguments that obscure larger abuses of power that proceeded before the outbreak of war and even the conclusions of peace. The South African War was not about conflict between Boer and British, but was a war that set the stage for segregation and apartheid. I think that it's something we need to remind ourselves about. So I'm going to conclude briefly here that similarly, we can and should look beyond the Ukrainian war as simply a fight for Ukrainian freedom and self-determination. What does this war, this current war in Europe and the global responses to it, tell us about inequality and the lack of freedom globally, especially as it comes at the tail end of a global pandemic of COVID-19? I'm just going to turn to a slide here of an image of peace here in Ukraine. What stories will we tell about its legacies? And how will we help these historical lessons frame the decisions we make as a world going forward? One can only hope that discourse over the Ukrainian war, like the South African War, considers the wider fallout. That many have been driven into poverty globally through the outbreak of war, the Ukrainian war, that warfare continues unabated elsewhere, and that nationalist narratives of wartime triumph are unhelpful for considering there's a limit here because of the settler colonial context of South Africa, that the South African War was fought in the context that there had been colonialism and one could argue even invasion then of Black polities and their land. And that sets the stage also for settler colonial control of land and labor and segregation and apartheid. So there's a quite different context to Ukraine. And I just concluded with a call for perhaps that we consider freedom in the context, not just in a liberal sense of political freedom, but in the broader context of something like Ukraine globally, its impact on people's ability to feed their families, to travel to work with the skyrocketing price of petrol. The Ukrainian war now in the world we want to make into the 21st century, not just about Ukrainians and their freedom, but what the economic fallout will be and how we can make a better world to grapple with that economic fallout we currently face. I hope that's as clear enough.
If some of the participants maybe don't have a question at the moment, but would like to contact Dr. Holdridge, you can contact the museum, or his email was also in the beginning of the presentation. And you can also send him an email and he'll be happy to help you or answer any questions you have regarding his presentation. We want to thank everybody, and especially Dr. Holdridge, for this really interesting presentation. And it's good to see how we can kind of connect historical facts with things happening today, and also realize how people's lives have been impacted previously, as we also feel it on our own lives today. Thank you very much and enjoy the day further.
Okay, and I want to thank everybody who tuned in, and also to the War Museum for inviting me to provide this presentation. I hope everyone has a wonderful Freedom Day on the 27th of April. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.